mean, right now we're watching a race in a district next to yours in the 16th. Jamal Bowman is doing very well against Elliot Engel. I mean, we can only tell so much at this point. We're going to know more, obviously, at the end of day Tuesday. But it seems to me that is sort of been that's a little illustrative of what you're talking about here, right? Chuck Schumer just jumped in to endorse in that race. Like, why is Chuck Schumer that excited? Why is there this level of, you mentioned, why is Wall Street going after you? Your one vote, you're in, do they really expect to have a Wall Street crony representing the Bronx? Why is there this much? I mean, are we seeing like a fight against progressives for the sake of saying we're going to beat progressives, as opposed to like, we need Elliot Engel in there because we need that vote against the next bill, the next deal against Iran?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there is kind of a disproportionate ire aimed at progressives. But I mean, maybe that's just me talking personally because I am one. But I also think that, 2 years ago when I won against Joe Crowley, it was kind of an emperor has no clothes type of moment. And I think that people got extremely concerned because he's not the only one that is in that type of position. Because the thing when it comes to corporate power, especially in the Democratic Party, is that there's more of us than there are of them. And by that, I mean, there are more progressive voters and people in the Democratic Party. Our policies are more popular than there are numerically of people who support corporate policies. And I said it back then, and I say it now, we've got people and they've got money. And in order for this kind of corporate hegemony to sustain itself, it requires Democrats in deep blue seats to support things like payday lenders, Wall Street brokers, private equity takeovers, etc. And that's been the big secret all along, right? Where if you can combine these deep blue seats with representatives that support Wall Street, that is the tipping factor. Or, it's not just Wall Street, it's our prison industrial complex, it's our military industrial complex, all of these fingers of the same hand. And so the key is these deep blue seats supporting these atrocious policies that are supported by payday lenders and all of these folks. And once you kind of get a crack in that, it gets very, very scary for a lot of these deep blue Democrats that are supported by those same interests. And so, I think that there's that, and also seniority in the House is a whole different ballgame. And so people want to protect those kind of the structural and procedural power where that derives. And so all of that kind of combines for the protection of policies and kind of this center of the universe that is these very well-funded, but kind of least representative interests.
So, I mean, is that part of the strategy? I mean, as you look, I mean, obviously, like, I think you're in a position that I think very few, frankly, freshman Congress people have ever been in, for that matter. You have an ability to fundraise that challenges people who have been there for decades. You have name recognition that is, in many ways unparalleled. So when you're thinking about how to build these coalitions, is going for those blue state Democrats in those deep blue seats who are, in your words, if I understand what you're saying, basically providing cover for the rest of the caucus to move to the right because they're ostensibly in the deepest blue seats. Is that part of the theory? Go after those and turn those first?
Well, I think that those seats tend to be very accessible for the progressive movement, right? It's accessible to the progressive movement. It's a lower lift in resources because it's already in our pocket, right? Whereas, yes, I believe that you can swing a seat with a progressive candidate. Absolutely. But it also costs $15 million to do so for one vote. Whereas you can run We can better use our small dollar resources, take that 10 million, scatter it around other seats. And then even if you don't end up, if that candidate doesn't end up pulling through at the end, you still get a dramatic shift in the incumbent's behavior as well. And that should not go ignored either. When I was running against Joe Crowley, he all of a sudden, I announced that I was going to run for Congress from behind a bar. And I was behind a bar working brunch at a coffee shop when I found out that he signed on to Medicare for All like a week or two later. And so then he started co-sponsoring all of these progressive policies just by the fact that I was running, even when I hadn't fundraised anything yet. And so I think it's more, you kind of get more bang for your buck in that sense, but it also takes very good progressive candidates, and I think that that's something that we need to be disciplined about as well. It's not just, it's not just about supporting any person who just rolls through and slaps a bunch of progressive policies on their websites. It's about, does this candidate have a history in the community? Do they have a context, a cultural, racial, socioeconomic context for the community? Have they served in any way? Doesn't mean that, have you worked yourself up the ladder of electoral politics, but Jamal Bowman is a school principal for 20 years. Like, he knows these families, he knows these kids, and he can effectively champion these policies in a way that, it is more than social media is an incredibly important role, but it also goes much deeper into kind of this candidate service. And, is there a real deal here? Is there a history here?
Right. All right. So lastly, last question for you. Once you've, when the dust settles and we get a House, after the 2018 election, let's assume for the sake of argument that the Democrats take the presidency, they take even the Senate. What do? You got 40% of the Democratic caucus is progressive. How do you work that inside game and make, there, at least there's a plurality there, right? What's the strategy to assert more progressive power within the caucus where there clearly seems to be some breaks on that?
Yeah, and we even have to be careful when we say 40% of the caucus is progressive as well, because there are moves that are made where the progressive caucus actually has no entry standards. Like, in order to join the progressive caucus, you don't have to sign on to Medicare. You don't have to be a co-sponsor of Medicare for All. You don't have to be a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. There's no kind of, you don't have to not be financed by corporate PACs. Like, there's no real pledge. You just kind of pay the caucus dues and you're in. And so as a consequence, there are a lot of these deep blue Democrats who say they're part of the progressive caucus, but actually aren't pushing progressive policies behind closed doors. In fact, they work against them. And so for us, I think it's still a continued, it needs to be like real continued pressure on progressive movements and those folks that say that they are progressive, because 40% is a lot. And even if we're able to expand that majority in the House, which I believe is also possible, now we're talking about making real movement. And so I think it requires a lot of outside pressure, but inside, we're going to have to also work a lot on supporting the standard bearers and uplifting them in positions of power. Barbara Lee ran for chair of the Democratic caucus, and she was essentially kind of undercut by a more conservative wing of the party. And so we really need to have our inside game in terms of uplifting and making sure that we're surging some of those progressive standard bearers in the same way that we also have an outside game. Because when you have, Pramila Jayapal or Barbara Lee or any one of these progressive leaders, Ilhan, Ayanna Pressley, et cetera, pushing on whether it's decarceral policy, whether it's healthcare policy, whether it's, foreign policy and beyond, we have to make sure that we've got their back and that we are keeping attention to the inside fights as they are happening. Because so often the reason we lose them is because folks realize that votes happen after they happen, whereas corporate elements of the party are very well attuned to what the business that's on the floor. And really that 48 hours before a vote is the most important 48 hours in determining the outcome.
They've got the resources to sort of do a little more advanced planning, as it were.
That's right.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming on. Good luck on Tuesday. Really appreciate it. We're big fans here. My daughter is a huge fan, and I have now become much cooler in her eyes. So I
Tell her to say
that.
hello.
I will. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.